The following program is made possible by the Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College, CUNY.
It started with call center employees and computer programmers, but now it's spreading to accountants, stock analysts, journalists, architects, and many others in the services sector who thought they were immune to global competition. I'm referring, of course, to outsourcing. It's become one of the hottest political issues of the moment and will almost certainly play a role in our upcoming presidential election. I'm Sarah Bartlett. Join me as we discuss this subject today on USA Inc. Our guest today is Justin Fox, a writer for Fortune magazine, whose stories on this topic have taken him all the way to Bangalore, India. Justin, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I am so pleased to have you here. Now, you went to India recently.
Yep.
And you wrote about outsourcing. Can you tell us a little bit about what you learned on your trip?
Well, I learned that young Indian call center workers can stay out really late at night and drink a lot. Because I went out with them every night. That was sort of one of the things I really wanted to do, was just go there and find out about their lives and find out what they thought of what they were doing.
Now, is the reason that they were out on the town that they have such great wages that they can afford to do that?
Yeah, by Indian standards, definitely. The other reason is they have these crazy hours, and so they all sleep during the day and go out at night.
What are
work
their
at night. The people who work in the call centers basically have to be on duty when it's daytime in the U.S. and the United Kingdom. And so with the U.S., we're pretty much 12 or 13 hours difference. So they're working through the middle of the night. So I guess I was getting people on their night off for the most part, but they're all nocturnal creatures.
What kind of wages do they make?
They make a whopping $2,000 a year, which is a ton more than they would be making otherwise, most of them. This is the call center workers, most of whom have gone to commercial colleges, have undergraduate business degrees, and would probably be working as hotel clerks or something like that otherwise.
And making what?
I would assume, I don't know, less than $1,000 a year.
So they've been able to double their salary, and they have very good degrees from the sounds of it.
Right. Well, and then the people with the technical degrees from the really top technical universities are making multiples of that, working in software, and for the most part working during the daytime rather than the middle of the night.
How do the individuals that you interviewed feel about the fact that they're basically doing outsourced jobs from the United States?
The younger ones haven't thought about it a whole lot, although when I was there, it was just, this whole issue was just sort of hitting the radar for the first time in the U.S. And a lot of these kids were, for the very first time, starting to deal with callers who were kind of hostile and were asking, where are you? And most of the ones I talked to were with companies that allowed them to say, I'm in Bangalore. And they were starting to encounter some hostility and wondering about it. And I think their general feeling is they have this sense of America as being a place of such wealth and prosperity and inventiveness that they just can't imagine that we envy them their little bit of success. And that's the general feeling. I did talk to some people more in the software area who are actually dealing with clients in the U.S. and actually have been involved in some of these situations where they're brought to a company and trained by the person who they then replace. And there was more ambivalence there, although there was still this general feeling of, this is the United States we're talking about. They'll come up with something else. We're just little India. Well, not little India. We're big India, but we're poor, pathetic India that's finally having some success. Don't take this away from us now.
Do you get a sense that Bangalore has changed considerably as a result of this move to outsource?
Well, Bangalore actually became this tech hub of India, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago. And so there's been this steady transformation for a long time in Bangalore. And it's grown, it doubled its population in 20 years. It's become, it was this pretty sleepy city where retirees like to go because the weather's nice. It's up about 3,000 feet above sea level. But Texas Instruments was the first, sort of started it. It located there, I think in the early 80s. And since then, all the big Indian software companies are either based there or have big operations there. So in Bangalore, this is a transformation that's been happening for a while. outside of Delhi, there's this suburb called Gurgaon that was basically this dusty intersection 10 years ago. And starting with American Express and General Electric locating big back office call center operations there, it has just grown. There are all these skyscrapers coming out of the ground. There are these shopping malls. It's utterly transformed. It's something that did not exist until really 5 years ago.
And I would guess that the impact of these higher wages means that they have a different level of consumption, a different number of items that they want to buy. Is that so? Are we exporting more than just jobs? Are we exporting culture?
We're definitely exporting culture. And definitely U.S. and European brands are very popular there. Everybody knows Nike shoes aren't actually made in the U.S. So, and lots of people are starting to drive cars, and they're almost all made in India, but there are Chevys and there are Toyotas and various global brands in there as well. So yeah, I don't think it's they're not wealthy enough to be having a whole lot of direct impact yet on buying things made in the U.S., but they're definitely helping some global companies, and one would assume that trickles back eventually. That's how the global economy is supposed to work, at least.
What did you find about the attitude they had towards their jobs? I mean, in the United States, a call center job is typically not one that one lusts after college. How do you think they feel about these jobs?
Well, obviously, at least right now, the general feeling is great enthusiasm, and it's, wow, what a fun job. And most of these call center companies, because it's all these 24-year-olds working there, I mean, the cafeterias are like singles bars. It's this whole vibe that you would never get at a call center in the U.S. The problem, though, is that I think a lot of the people burn out on it after a couple years, and they get tired of working all night and sleeping during the day. And so they're just right now so much competition, so many different call center companies that there's lots of turnover. And actually, a lot of the people in the Indian call center business are thinking that they're going to have to move towards a workforce more like that call centers in the U.S. have done for years, which is move to smaller cities and hire a lot of women in their 30s and 40s. And that's where they're headed. There's some issues with it's the kids in these urban areas who are most likely to speak English that we in America or the UK would understand. I mean, lots of people in India speak English, but these are the people who are more likely to be watching American TV and sort of affected by American slang. And so there are going to be problems with that, but that's where it seems to be headed.
Did you detect that there were quality issues from the standpoint of the companies that are doing this outsourcing? I mean, is this more than it's being...
While I was there, I didn't get a lot of that, mainly because I was sort of dealing with some of the early companies that were the first ones that got into it that I think have pretty high standards. But basically everybody and his brother's getting into this in India, and I'm sure there are a lot of relatively lower quality operations. And definitely since coming back and getting emails about my article and such, there just been a lot of companies that I think have gone too quickly to this. They're like, oh wow, these people make a tenth of what our people in the US are making. And then they suddenly shift all these calls over there, and there are just lots of difficulties. It's still far away, it's a different country, there are communication problems. And even though this initial wave got this incredibly high quality kids just out of college, really smart kids, there's so much competition now that I would imagine the quality of the people has dropped some as well.
Do you hear about companies that are moving back to the United States because they're disappointed with what they found overseas?
Bits and pieces of it. I mean, I talked to the CEO of a small internet company that had shifted everything to India and then shifted everything back. I know Dell has been in the news a lot because they shift a lot of their call center technical help operations to Bangalore, and they've shifted a little of it back, but they haven't really made a big shift.
And that's because of quality issues?
And complaints, at least. And I think there were real, from what I've just going on the message boards at Dell, it seems to be real. There are some real problems.
Well, it's become a huge political issue, obviously, in this country. There's been a great outcry. How do you feel about the economics of this? I mean, in theory, this is supposed to be a good thing. We believe in the global economy, and we believe in exporting democratic capitalism all over the world. And yet, when it starts to actually happen, we seem to get a little ambivalent about it. What do you think about the economic theory of this?
Well, I think it's one of those things that over the medium to long term, of course, I think it is a good thing. And I think it's enormously positive for the United States and the world if India can finally make the leap to prosperity. I mean, a democratic, free country with 1 billion people, it would be the greatest ally the United States could have, the greatest sort of solid partner the world economy could have. But obviously over the short run, that doesn't do you any good if you just lost your job. And I do think there's a economists have a problem with a little bit too glibly, like Greg Mankiw, who's chairman of Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, and a great guy, great economist, but he just sort of glibly said, of course, we're getting things at lower cost, that's good for the economy. He's absolutely right, but that doesn't mean that the people who are losing their jobs to this now are going to benefit from these lower costs. The economy as a whole will, and definitely the global economy as a whole will. But that doesn't, a lot of these software engineers who thought they had it made 5 years ago are suddenly realizing that they're in a tough business.
Well, the food chain, this trend towards outsourcing has really gone right up the food chain. I mean, it used to be that it was just call center workers or maybe even auto manufacturing.
It actually started, well, with India, it started on the top of the food chain with people doing R&D for places like Texas Instruments and Intel. But it was so tiny and that business was growing so fast that nobody cared.
But now it's really spread. You see research analysts from Wall Street firms, right. Their work is being outsourced. You see architecture being outsourced, animation. I mean, it's really journalism. Yep. I guess the attitude here is, where will it stop, and will there be any jobs left here? And if they are, will they be good jobs?
That's a complete leap of faith. And the economic history of the past 200 years would tell us it'll work out, but I have nothing to tell people in particular about how that will work. I mean, clearly the jobs that can get moved, at least if it's a specific U.S. job getting outsourced to India, which isn't always true with the R&D, that sometimes it's completely different things. But if a job can be moved, it means that it's a job that can be broken down into pretty simple things, like a script with the call centers. And so I would think you want a job that can't be broken down into a script, but I don't know what that would be. I'm still under the delusion that my job is like that, but I may learn differently within the next 10 years.
The Bush administration, as you said, got into a lot of hot water when they announced that this was a very good thing for the economy, but I waited to see other economists rise to defend this theory, and I didn't see any. Do you think that the economists are beginning to lose faith themselves? No,
I just think it's because, Paul Krugman, who is a columnist with the New York Times and a great economist at Princeton, his writings in the past have always agreed exactly with what Mankiw is saying right now, but he's a critic of the Bush administration, so he's not going to jump out and defend Greg Mankiw. And I think most academic economists are a little more likely to lean away from the Bush administration, partly for the good reason that I think the deficit and sort of budget policy of the Bush administration has been a little nutty. And so even though I would say the vast majority of economists would agree with Mankiw's statement, they don't feel like, for one thing, they don't feel like getting turned into a pariah like he has been, and they don't really want to help out the Bush administration.
Right. We'll be right back.
The Zicklin School of Business at Baruch College of the City University of New York is the largest and most diverse accredited business school in the United States, offering high-quality, full-time and part-time degree programs at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. For information about the Zicklin School of Business, please visit our website, zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu. That's zicklin.baruch.cuny.edu.
Welcome back. I'm talking with Justin Fox, a writer for Fortune magazine. Justin, can you quantify for us the kind of cost savings that companies can achieve by going offshore?
I'm no outsourcing expert, but obviously if the wages are about a tenth of what they would pay in the U.S., then you don't get all that savings. You're paying for the phone lines, which the whole reason we're able to do this is because all these companies spent billions of dollars laying broadband cables to India and then went bankrupt, and now that capacity is really cheap. So that's not a big expense, but there are just lots of hassles and expenses built in. So maybe they're cutting their costs in half on these things.
So if you have 50% savings, if you're a small business in the United States or even a large business, there's such a compelling argument. What would be the countervailing forces? Why wouldn't somebody want to do this?
Well, with a small business, the problem is that you'd be dealing with some contractor, some Indian company, and to keep the costs down, you can't go over and visit all the time. And you can't have them come over and visit you all the time because that wipes out your cost savings right there. And so basically you're suddenly putting what might be this crucial part of your business in the hands of people you don't really know who are thousands and thousands of miles away from you. And it's clearly going to be a disaster for a lot of companies who do that without thinking hard enough. Big companies like GE and American Express were the real pioneers in this, and they've made huge upfront costs, but they control the process. They're over there, and I think they're pretty happy with their results.
I hear, though, that the cost savings that they were able to get initially are becoming reduced as the employee turnover problem mounts.
Oh, I'm sure. And the Indian rupee, which had been basically steadily going down against the dollar and other major world currencies for, I don't know, the last 50 years, it's actually started rising over the past 5 years. And over time, that'll mean Indian wages, the same wage in India that's $2,000 now will be $4,000 in a couple of years. So a lot of that cost advantage disappears.
So there may be some kind of leveling of these two economies. We'll come down and they'll come up. That may not be.
Yeah, one would hope that we can, that we just don't go up as fast as they do is the hope. And I think that's a realistic goal. It's just in a time when the U.S. economy seems to be sort of sputtering, even though it's growing, it's not generating a whole lot of jobs. Obviously, people are dubious about that, and I don't blame them.
Well, there's some proposals on the table as the political campaign heats up for the next presidential election that we do things to alter the tax code, for example, that there shouldn't be an economic incentive for American businesses to outsource. How do you feel about that?
I don't know this because John Kerry has this tax code plan that I really haven't studied and don't know well enough to say whether it makes sense. I don't see anything wrong with tweaking laws a little bit. As I was talking about before, long run, this is a good thing for us, but that doesn't mean we can't do a few things in the short run that might make our long run a little less attractive, but at least will keep a few more people employed now. I think the general trend of U.S. policy should be towards free trade. But first of all, I don't see any problem if there are, in fact, incentives in the tax code forcing people to move things overseas, then yeah, you want to fix that. But I don't think it's disastrous to put up little barriers, especially if they're temporary here and there.
I think it's sort of an interesting question that an executive would face in this country. How much should they feel that they have a moral obligation to hire a U.S. worker as opposed to improving the quality of life of an Indian worker? And I guess that's the question the Indians are asking back at us, which is, why would you deprive us of this? This is what you're supposed to be all about.
Well, I imagine most of these executives are also thinking more than either of those things. They're simply thinking about what can I do to increase shareholder returns and make my stock options worth more and things like that, which we've sort of decided is their job. But yeah, I mean, people's lives in India aren't worth any less than our lives here. And I totally understand if you're a labor union that represents a bunch of American workers, you should be looking out for them. But it bothers me when people make arguments that sound sort of universal that this is a bad or immoral or unethical thing. I mean, these are people these are not sweatshops where these people work in India. These are good jobs and good lives that they're having.
But I think there is an expectation that we're Americans. American companies should defend the rights and opportunities of American workers. How do you get them to see the world as more globally interlinked?
Well, I mean, the thing with these companies is how much are they American companies? Their shareholders, probably the biggest chunk is in the U.S. of a company like a GE or American Express. But they have tons of shareholders in Europe, and probably a bunch in Japan and East Asia. And I mean, on the one hand, it's this disturbing thing that there are these multinational companies that don't seem to be beholden to any one country or any one government. And especially on tax issues, that can be sort of alarming because they can just play governments off against each other. But on the other hand, okay, here we have these big, powerful organizations that are against, to a certain extent, against nationalism, against bigotry. For a totally bottom line reason, not because they're great people necessarily, but it's sort of nice having that force out there in the world.
But if you're someone who's 24 years old and you have a couple of children and you have a call center job and you're based in some remote area of Texas or whatever, and you find out that your job's been cut because it's going to some 24-year-old who's living the life of luxury over in India, I think that's a hard message. I think that there has to be more political work done, laying the groundwork for a better transition. I think that's what the issues are about.
Well, and it's just the simple thing that if there were job growth in the U.S. like in the late 90s, nobody would care. And maybe one of the reasons why there isn't is because of this outsourcing, although it's clearly not the whole reason.
There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal recently about a company that processes mortgages, and they decided that instead of taking the burden of this decision on themselves, they would allow consumers to choose. So if you press 1 when you're calling up to have your mortgage processed, you can choose to have the work done by an American worker. And if you press 2 on your phone, you can be connected to someone in India, and you'll get the application processed 2 days faster, which I thought was an interesting response. Let the consumer decide.
Yeah, one of the things, because it really bothers me when a lot of American companies tell either if they have their own operations in India or they're contracting with somebody, their rule is that the people in the call centers can't say where they are, and I think that's really offensive. And
Why?
Because it's dishonest. It's sort of this whole pretending that they're in America, and I think that almost bothers people more than if they just call up and, okay, this guy's in Bangalore, what's the weather like in Bangalore? I think over time that Americans would be pretty comfortable with that. But people are understandably uncomfortable with being lied to, and I think that's what people feel, that some of this call center culture of, I mean, all these kids in the call centers are supposed to, I mean, not that they don't do it already, but they, watch Friends to practice during their breaks and things like that to get their lingo down right.
There is another proposal on the table that you would be forced to identify where you're from if you're in a call center or a tech service center. And what do you think of that idea?
I mean, I don't have any huge problem with it. I think it'd be better if businesses just figured out for themselves that honesty is a better policy in this, but I don't think that would be disastrous.
I mean, I think the goal probably is to shame American companies into not wanting to have very many of those calls be answered outside of the country. But interestingly, with this example of the mortgage processor, about 80% are running in favor of getting the application processed more quickly.
Right, and I think a lot of what it would do, it would just put the burden of education on the individual companies, saying, okay, here's your choice, and this is why we're doing it. And I think people would respond to that. I just always think this sort of thinking you can magically suddenly move all of your tech support from Silicon Valley to Bangalore and no one will notice. People don't like that. It's dishonest.
I think that it's very hard to try to persuade the rest of the world that they should embrace our values and our economic system and then pull back when it isn't convenient for us. Do you get a sense that there are some people in India who you talked with who will be upset and will start to develop more of an anti-American feeling if this doesn't go well?
Yeah, I mean, right now it's more just this, you've been telling us to do this for decades. Now we're finally opening up our economy, and now you're going to tell us to stop? Because India had sort of this disastrous policy of trying to do everything within its own borders. That was Nehru's idea, that India would build up a socialist industrial democracy within its borders, and it just didn't work. And so now, I mean, basically pushed by this call center and tech industry, barriers to imports into India from the U.S. and elsewhere are steadily dropping. They keep dropping their tariffs. If anybody's noticed, they've stopped saying nasty things about Pakistan, and a lot of it is because of pressure from these outsourcing and IT companies. I mean, right now they're playing cricket. Well, right now, when we're taping this, they're playing cricket against each other for the first time in more than a decade, I think. And so it's this wonderful influence on Indian politics. And clearly, if it suddenly went into reverse, I think the politics would go into reverse and go back to a more nationalist, Hinduist sort of ideology.
Which isn't to anyone's advantage.
Right.
I mean, I think over the long term, you can imagine a world where wages in India will rise as a result of this. They will become themselves a wealthier, more industrialized society. And it's not inconceivable that they, in turn, could start to outsource to other countries. I mean, I think the effect of global capitalism is to constantly search out ways to create cost savings for businesses. So can you imagine a world where India starts to outsource to a less developed country?
The one thing that's pretty unique about India is this fact that there are millions of well-educated people who speak English. And therefore most of this call center phenomenon is mostly one for the UK and the US. The rest of Europe, I mean, they're looking for places. They're trying to start call centers down in former French colonies in Africa and trying to get Eastern Europeans to do it for Germany, but it's much more difficult.
But it's not just call centers. If you're an animator, you don't
that's
really
true.
care.
That's for anybody. You're right.
You can be doing that in China,
right?
In the outer reaches.
No,
of China.
that will definitely happen. And I think, I mean, the textile industry, which much of it had gone to India, is increasingly moving out of India to Bangladesh and elsewhere where it's cheaper.
Thank you, Justin. We've been very fortunate to have as our guest today Justin Fox, a writer for Fortune magazine. We'll be right back.
Some people think of New York as the world's second home. The City University of New York, with students coming from 90 countries and speaking more than 155 languages, is the world's first university. Find us on the web at cuny.edu or call us at 1-800-CUNY-YES.
Sending work offshore to countries where labor is cheaper and regulations more lax has long been a hallmark of American manufacturers. But now those same forces are driving industries with white-collar employees to adopt the same strategy. As outsourcing continues its climb up the food chain, CEOs of companies that outsource are even being called traders. The reality is we live in a global economy. We can try to throw sand into the gears to slow down the adjustment process, but it's not realistic to expect profit-seeking companies to resist large cost savings by confining themselves to U.S. borders. It's also not fair to workers overseas to encourage them to embrace free trade and global capitalism and then penalize them when they turn out to be competitive. The trick is to stay ahead of the curve, to invest in research and development that will spawn innovation, new industries, and new jobs. We also need to soften the transition for those whose jobs are permanently displaced. It's not pretty, but economists don't describe capitalism as the process of creative destruction for nothing. For USA Inc., I'm Sarah Bartlett.